Okay, 50th episode is done, let's get back to it. I advertised an RP heavy campaign on Roll20 and I got started on Roll20. The game was in a homebrew world similar to Faerun. It's a sandbox campaign, so if the players don't like a quest, you don't have to do it. The player, who I'll call Dratst, his character was a blatant ripoff, was mad that he went half a session without combat. He was in the Discord trying to get the rest of the party to stage a strike unless I made more combat. The rest of the party either ignored him or made memes about weirdos wanting to play a TTRPG like Call of Duty. He then threatened to leave unless I promised to add more combat. I just kicked him and kept the campaign pushing. Man, I'm always going on and on and on about setting expectations for your game as a DM, but I don't think I ever really addressed players ignoring those expectations entirely. I've read a lot of posts on this sub, and now that enough time has passed since the story, I think it's time to share my own horror story. Sorry for the length, I tried to cut the unimportant bits. I love D&D, especially being a DM. At the start of the pandemic and during the time of lockdowns, I had the itch to want to run some D&D. I decided to try my hand at forming a group using LFG. I made my post there stating I was going to run Out of the Abyss and waited for the responses. Anyone who has posted there looking for players knows that responses come pretty fast. I was naive, however, and did not do any vetting and just let people join my game on the first come, first served basis. This is where the horror story begins. The first person to respond was a guy who I will call Jeff for this story. Before I invited people to the Discord server where I would run the game, I did a quick little voice chat with him to vibe check. By quick, I mean like 1 minute of talking, then I sent him the link. Jeff was a little bit more pushy in his voice call. He immediately started asking about the other players, what they were playing, how much homebrew I did to the system, what the game was going to be like, etc. Not a major red flag, people can be excitable when it comes to the game, so I paid no mind and invited him to the server. I eventually found enough people to play and set a date and time for session 0. Prior to session 0, I encourage everyone to chat and talk and be friendly to get to know each other and maybe discuss characters. This is where the first red flag appeared. Jeff would not only be in chat constantly, but dominated any conversation that occurred. He had a very specific character he wanted to play, a very edgy half-elf vengeance paladin, and would go on and on about it to everyone in the chat and kept asking other players to play characters to complement his character. I tried to keep the peace by saying that people can play whatever they want and that we will be doing character creation during session 0 as a group so people can talk and share backstories and stuff like that. Jeff would not let up, and eventually the chat remained silent until session 0 because they did not want to be ranted to by Jeff. Second red flag, the constant arguing. Jeff loved to debate and argue everything, especially rules and limitations I had set. Even before session 0, Jeff would constantly ask me about specific rulings with personal messages. It's been a while, so I do not remember a specific example, but it would normally go, if I do X and then do Y and then cast Z spell, I should be able to do this oddly specific thing to gain an advantage or bonus damage or disable the enemy, right? I would tell him how I would rule, and then he would go on long rants about how physics and science works, and how the rules technically say this, and how he was right and I should allow it. He also loved to bring up how a DM should never say no, and just allow his crazy ideas to always work. This will come up later. Session 0, the red flags continue. We finally make it to session 0, and the players start creating their characters. Jeff, the entire time, tries to point out how the party does not have a rogue to check for traps and needs a dedicated healer, and that they need to start thinking about how to cover weaknesses right away. This, of course, irritates the players. I reiterate that I balance things around the party so they don't need to worry about being too optimal in their party dynamic. Jeff would continue to talk about the plan for specific situations given the party's quote-unquote weaknesses, but the other players just ignore him. Also, during this campaign, I went over the rules I would use, and of course, Jeff had a lot to say about that. I said I will be requiring variant encumbrance rules, with the added homebrew that armor weighs half when worn, and that the party will have to track food and water as stated in the DMG. Jeff hated this. He claimed that variant encumbrance rules ruin his build and that's unfair. I told him that I set up a survival horror game and I am not going to remove this rule. Second, he claims that the food and water rules are unrealistic and should be a lot easier. For those of you who don't know, the DMG states that small/medium creatures need 1 pound of food and 1 gallon of water per day or they will suffer exhaustion effects. Jeff claimed that this is unrealistic and should be way less and tried using crappy science to justify this. Thankfully, one of the other players is a veteran who served in Iraq and claimed that based on his real-life experiences, that the rules in the Dungeon Master Guide were actually really generous, and thankfully, this finally shut Jeff up. I later learned Jeff was obsessed with the idea of the military. Lastly, he would not stop pushing for me to let the party use the variant flanking rules so he didn't have to rely on the other players for advantage. I denied him and he argued, of course. Clearly not a team player, which the first 2 sessions showed. Session 1 half. Session 1 out of... Session 1 out of 2. I'm keeping that in there. Session 1 out of 2, the last straw. This is where everyone got sick of Jeff. During the first session, Jeff would not let anyone else talk and always had to be part of whatever conversation the players were having, even if his character was not actually present for the interaction. Jeff had the need to be the leader of the group as well. Whenever they had to figure out a challenge, Jeff immediately had a crazy 100% foolproof plan that would work as long as everyone did exactly what he said to do. He tried to constantly tell other players what they should do because it was the most optimal route. He basically would not let anyone else play the game. Not only did he do this, he would metagame everything. He would try to warn others about monster statistics like HP, AC, and weaknesses, and I had to constantly remind him to cut it out. During combat, he would try to ask to do crazy maneuvers to see what he could get away with. One example would be that he wanted his character to do a standing front flip to jump over an enemy to get behind them and grab their dropped weapon in the process. I said, no. He of course argued that he should be able to roll for it. I read him the jumping rules in the player's handbook. He sulked and accepted it. And, like I said, he would try to tell other players what to do on their turns. Thus was the first session. The second session, he just kept snapping at the other players for speaking about what-ifs and their plans out loud because Jeff thought that doing so would make the DM, me, change things to ruin their plans or throw out the worst-case scenario onto the players. I am not an adversarial DM and would never do that, and I had to constantly remind him that too. In between the first and second session, I talked to him about stopping with some of his behaviors and told the other players that they can call it out too if it happens again. Just noting here that latter one was Jeff's idea. Well, whenever Jeff was called out, he would overly apologize and say things like, "I'm sorry I'm being so autistic." Given that one of the players is actually autistic, this made everyone very angry. After the second session, I had a conversation with Jeff and kicked him from the game. Never thought I had to kick someone from a game before, but he was ruining everything for everybody. The game is continuing till this day, thankfully, but I never thought I would have to deal with that guy before this moment. If you want to hear more about the power of no when it comes to DMing, I have a whole video about it linked in the cards. Look, here's the thing, guys, it is really important that you stop problem players, and that's what this DM did. It did take 2 sessions, but I'm glad that he gave him a little bit of a chance to change his ways. This guy, Jeff, had his chance, and he threw it away by being an asshole. That's just how it goes. You cannot allow someone like that to continue to ruin the game for you and the rest of the group. Look, I'm all for optimized D&D groups and optimized parties and having cool builds that work with each other, but this guy is taking it to a level that is unnecessary. Number one, clearly the rest of the party is not interested in that. I've said that min-maxing is okay if the entire group is okay with it. In this case, we had one player who wants to be super overpowered while the rest of the players are again just left behind. That kind of thing is not okay. Finally, the biggest problem is spotlight hogging. Look, most of the time, spotlight hoggers are just people who are really excited for the game. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, and those kind of situations can be handled peacefully. This is an example of the worst type of spotlight hog. A guy who is not just excited, someone who just doesn't care about the rest of the party. That's not just a bad player, that's a sign of a kind of rotten person, and you really should not let them around your table. Alright, that's all I have to say about that. If you guys enjoyed this episode of RPG Horror Stories, then please do leave a like. If you want to see more of my content, then please do hit subscribe, and subscribe to Crispy's Tavern. And finally, if you want to leave your own stories or thoughts, go down to the comments down below. In essence, like, comment, subscribe. I will see you all next time. Farewell.